My dear child, what you are carrying right now is too heavy because it was never meant for you to carry alone. And the reason the weight has been bending you is not that the wall is weak, but that the wall has been holding a load that was always designed for a full foundation, and no single wall, however strong it was built, was ever engineered to sustain what a foundation distributes across multiple points of support. Do not scroll past this. What I am about to reveal is not about finding the strength to carry harder. This is about a structural correction, a specific designer level. The load exceeds the wall's specifications. This weight requires a foundation correction that the one who built the wall is making tonight. Not because the wall failed, but because the wall has been holding what only a foundation can hold. And the stress fractures forming in the quiet places are the structural evidence that the load category was never matched to the support category it was placed on. The wall did not fail. The load was misplaced. You have been bending, not dramatically, quietly. The specific bone level sleep does not fix this. The exhaustion is deeper than tiredness, bending that a load-bearing wall produces when the weight placed on it exceeds what a single point of support was designed to sustain over the duration. Sustaining has been required. The financial pressure, the relational strain, the unanswered prayers, the responsibilities that belong to multiple people somehow ending up in one set of hands. My beloved child, the stress fractures are forming in the quiet places where nobody is looking. And the fractures are not evidence of weakness. They are the structural warning that a load-bearing wall issues before the visible collapse. The wall's way of telling the designer that the weight category exceeds the wall's specifications. Stay here. What I reveal next is what the foundation was always designed to hold, and why the designer is reaching toward the weight right now. Type foundation weight if you have been bending under a weight that sleep cannot fix, carrying what was meant for multiple points of support on a single wall. And God just told you the stress. Fractures forming in the quiet places are not weakness, but the structural warning that the load category exceeds the wall's specifications, and the designer is reaching toward the weight tonight, because what you are holding was always designed for a foundation, not a wall. Before we go any further, I need to tell you something that genuinely surprised me. A neuroscientist discovered a simple 7-second technique that actually rewires how your brain processes thoughts. And when I tried it, the difference was almost unsettling. My focus sharpened, ideas started connecting faster, and that mental fog, gone. This isn't manifestation nonsense. It's backed by real brain science, and thousands of people are already seeing results. But here's the catch. Only 5 spots are left. If something inside you is saying, try it, trust that instinct. Click the link in the description or pinned comment before it's too late. The weight did not arrive at foundation level all at once. It accumulated incrementally, which means the wall absorbed the load, increased gradually enough that the transition from wall-appropriate weight to foundation-required weight was never marked by a single moment where the person carrying it could identify the crossing from manageable to structural. My beloved child, I need you to understand how the accumulation works. A load-bearing wall can hold significant weight. The first layer of weight placed on the wall was within the wall's specifications. The wall held, the holding was stable, and the stability of the first layer communicated to the person carrying it that the wall was capable. The second layer was added. The wall held. The third layer arrived. The wall held. And the holding at each layer reinforced the belief that the wall could sustain whatever was placed on it, because the wall had sustained everything so far. The wall held at every layer. until the fractures began forming at a layer the wall could not announce. My dear one, the transition from wall appropriate to foundation required happened silently. No alarm sounded when the weight crossed the threshold. No structural warning was issued at the moment the load shifted from manageable to excessive. The wall simply began absorbing weight it was never specified to carry, holding longer than the specifications permitted, because the wall was built strong, and strong walls exceed their specifications before they show the fractures the exceeding produces. Exceeding specifications quietly is what strong walls do, and strong walls breaking quietly is the danger of strength. This message was not released for everyone carrying something heavy. This was aimed at the one person whose specific accumulated, layer by layer, crossed the threshold. Without a warning weight, has transitioned from wall appropriate to foundation required without the person carrying it ever being told. The transition occurred. The person whose strength has been the reason the fractures have remained invisible for as long as they have. Type crossed without warning if the weight accumulated layer by layer until the load transitioned from wall appropriate to foundation required without a single moment where you could identify the crossing. And your strength is the fractures have remained invisible because strong walls exceed their specifications before showing the stress the exceeding produces, meaning the holding that looked like capacity was always the wall absorbing a load category. It was never engineered to sustain alone. I have been watching the fractures form since the weight crossed the threshold, and the watching has been the specific grief of a designer who built the wall and who knows its specifications and who has been standing beside a structure whose strength is holding a load the designer never drew the specifications for it to carry alone. My dear one, not from the blueprint office reviewing the specifications at a distance, from beside the wall, at the fracture points, standing where the stress is forming in the quiet places the outside cannot see, watching the internal structure absorb the consequences of a load category the wall's engineering was never designed. To sustain at the duration the sustaining has been required. I have been at the fracture points, watching what the outside cannot see. My beloved child, I watched the specific layer that crossed the threshold. There was a specific addition, a specific responsibility, a specific pressure, a specific weight that arrived on top of the layers already being sustained, whose placement on the wall pushed the total past the specification limit the wall was built to carry. The wall did not announce the crossing. The wall absorbed the crossing, and the absorbing without announcing is what produced the first stress fracture in a location the outside world has no visibility into. The first fracture formed in silence, and silence is where the fractures have been accumulating since. I chose you for this message because the fractures have reached the count where the structural integrity of the wall is approaching the threshold between holding and failing, not because the wall is weak, because the wall has been strong beyond its specifications for a duration that has consumed the margin the strength was providing. The margin is thinning, the fractures are accumulating, and the designer who built the wall is reaching toward the weight tonight because the reaching cannot wait until the margin is gone. My child, the reaching is happening before the failing, because the designer reaches before the collapse, not after. Type before the failing if God has been at the fracture points, watching the stress form in the quiet places, and the fractures have reached the count where the margin the strength was providing is thinning toward the threshold between holding and failing, meaning the designer is reaching toward the weight tonight because the reaching happens before the collapse, not after, and the structural correction cannot wait until the margin, the wall, has been. Holding on is consumed by one more layer the specifications were never drawn to sustain. I know what the solo carrying has been doing to the specific part of you where your capacity to receive help is stored, my beloved child. The capacity to receive help was not always closed. There was a season, earlier than the current weight, before the accumulation crossed the threshold, where the wall accepted support from other points in the structure. The accepting was not weakness then. The accepting was normal structural behavior. A wall receiving distributed support from the foundation, the way walls are designed to operate within a larger support system. The closing happened when the support thinned, and thinned support produced solo carrying. My child, I watched the closing develop through the specific sequence the thinning produced. The support points that were present during the manageable layers began thinning as the layers accumulated. People who were carrying portions of the weight stepped back. Circumstances that were providing structural assistance shifted, and the wall that was designed to operate within a distributed system found itself holding what the distributed system had been helping carry, alone, without the support points, absorbing the full load on a single structure. The full load landed on one wall, and one wall held what multiple walls were carrying. I watched the holding produce a specific adaptation at the layer where your willingness to receive support is maintained. The adaptation said, the support left. The weight stayed, and the wall held anyway. Therefore, the wall does not need the support. The adaptation converted the abandonment of the support points into evidence that the wall was always sufficient without them, when the wall was never sufficient without them. And the holding without them was the wall exceeding its specifications. Rather than proving it did not need the specifications it was designed to operate within. The exceeding felt like sufficiency. The sufficiency was always structural excess, and structural excess is what produces the fractures the quiet places are carrying right now. The deepest wound the solo carrying produced was not the fractures. It was the specific, private, never confessed spiritualizing of the solo carrying as faithfulness, producing a framework where holding the weight alone became the holy response, and releasing the weight became the faithless one. My dear child, you spiritualized the bending, not deliberately, necessarily, because a person whose support points thinned while the weight increased needs a framework that makes the solo carrying feel purposeful rather than unsustainable. And the framework that was available, the specific, God gives his toughest battles to his strongest soldiers. Endurance is faith. Carrying harder is carrying holier theological framing. Fit the solo carrying so precisely that the structural excess became indistinguishable from spiritual virtue. The framework said endurance. The fractures said excess, and the framework was louder. My beloved child, I watched the spiritualizing produce its most devastating effect at the specific threshold, where the wall could have released the weight onto the foundation. There was a moment, a specific identifiable, the foundation was being offered moment, where the partnership I was extending to carry what the wall was never specified to hold alone was present and available, and the wall rejected the partnership because the spiritualized framework classified the accepting of help as the abandonment of the endurance, the faithfulness required. The wall rejected the foundation in the name of faith. My dear one, I watched the rejection close the receiving system at the identity level, the layer where a person's understanding of what faithfulness looks like is maintained. The rejection installed a definition of faithfulness that equated solo carrying with spiritual strength and partnership with spiritual weakness. And a definition that equates partnership with weakness in a person whose specification require partnership is a definition that is killing the wall in the name of the faith the wall is performing. The definition is the wound. The carrying is the symptom. And the wound is about to be healed by the designer who never wrote solo carrying into the wall's specifications. Type solo was never the specification if you spiritualized the solo carrying as faithfulness, equating the rejection of partnership with spiritual strength. And there was a moment the foundation was offered, and the wall rejected it because the framework classified accepting help as abandoning the endurance the faithfulness required. When the designer who built the wall never wrote solo carrying into the specifications and the definition of faithfulness that equates partnership with weakness, has been killing the wall in the name of the faith the wall is performing. The solo carrying was never the specification. It was the adaptation the wall produced when the support points thinned, and the framework spiritualized the adaptation as endurance rather than recognizing it as structural excess that the designer never included in the engineering the wall was built to operate within. My beloved one, I need to permanently separate the solo carrying from the faithfulness the solo carrying has been dressed as. Your system classified the solo carrying as the highest form of spiritual endurance, the evidence of a faith strong enough to carry what was placed on it without requiring the support the designer's specifications include. The truth is, the solo carrying was the most dangerous form of structural excess, a wall exceeding its specifications in the name of a faithfulness whose definition was written by the thinning of the support rather than by the designer who built the wall. The thinning wrote the definition. The designer did not, and the designer's definition outranks the thinnings. My child, a load-bearing wall operating within its specifications does not carry alone. It carries within a foundation. The foundation distributes the weight across multiple points so that no single point absorbs what the full structure was designed to hold together. A wall carrying alone is not a wall demonstrating superior strength. It is a wall demonstrating structural isolation. And structural isolation is the condition that produces the fractures the wall has been forming in the quiet places. Isolation is not endurance. Isolation is the absence of the foundation the endurance was supposed to operate within. My dear one, the strength the wall demonstrated during the solo carrying was real. The strength was never the question. The question was whether the strength was being applied to a load the strength was specified to carry. And the answer, visible in the fractures the quiet places are holding, is that the strength was being applied to a load category above the wall's specification. And above specification loads require the foundation the strength was being deployed without. The strength was real, the load was wrong, and the correction is not about the strength. It is about the load. The foundation just activated beneath the wall, and the specific multiple support points engaging load distribution system coming online. The structure that was always designed to carry this weight is now operational. Activation that is happening beneath the wall right now is the first structural evidence that the designer is deploying. The support system the solo carrying was preventing from engaging. My beloved child, something shifted within the last few days. Not in the weight, in the structure beneath the weight. The specific, almost imperceptible. Something is being placed beneath me. The ground I am standing on just became more solid shift. that a wall produces when the foundation the designer built begins activating beneath a structure that has been operating in isolation for the duration of the solo carrying season. Something became more solid beneath you. And more solid means the foundation is engaging. My dear one, I need you to understand what happens when the foundation activates beneath a wall that has been carrying alone. The foundation does not ask the wall for permission to engage. The foundation is activated by the designer, and the designer activates the foundation when the fracture count in the wall reaches the threshold where one more layer of solo carrying would transition the fractures from stress marks to structural failure. The activation is the designer's response to the fracture count, not to the wall's request. I have been building the foundation behind every season of the solo carrying. While the wall was bending, and the framework was spiritualizing, and the definition was equating partnership with weakness, I was beneath the structure. Laying the support points, the foundation, requires positioning the distribution system the weight demands, ensuring every point of support was ready for the moment the designer would activate the system. The solo carrying was preventing the wall from using. My child, the foundation is not being built tonight. The foundation was built during the solo carrying. Tonight, the foundation is being activated, and activated foundations carry what isolated walls cannot. Type foundation activating if something shifted beneath the weight within the last few days. The ground becoming more solid, something being placed beneath you, and the shift is the designer activating the foundation that was built during the solo carrying season. Because the fracture count reached the threshold where one more layer would transition the stress marks to structural failure, and the activation is the designer's response to the fractures, not to the wall's request for help. What you are carrying right now is too heavy because it was never meant for you to carry alone. The title carries that specific diagnosis because the weight being held by the wall tonight is not a wall category load being carried by a wall that should be stronger, but a foundation category load being carried by a wall that should not be carrying it. Without the foundation, the designer built to hold it. My dear one, I need you to understand the weight of the phrase, never meant for you to carry alone. The title does not say the weight is too heavy for you, does not say you are not strong enough, says never meant for you to carry alone. The never meant is a design specification. The designer's original engineering of the load-bearing relationship between the wall and the weight, declaring that the load category was always assigned to the foundation rather than to the wall, and the wall's carrying of it was never part of the specifications the designer drew. The wall is not inadequate. The assignment was incorrect, and incorrect assignments are corrected by the designer. My beloved child, this is directly connected to the title and to the specific exhaustion the solo carrying has been producing. The title says, God said, put it down. The put it down is not permission to abandon the weight. It is the structural instruction to transfer the weight from the wall to the foundation. The specific load transfer, single point to distributed system, wall to foundation movement that the designer performs when the weight is reassigned from the incorrect category to the correct one. My child, putting it down does not mean the weight disappears. Putting it down means the weight is transferred to the structure that was designed to hold it. The foundation does not eliminate the weight. The foundation distributes the weight, and distributed weight on a designed foundation produces stability that concentrated weight on an isolated wall cannot. The weight stays, the carrier changes, and the changing of the carrier is the correction the designer is making tonight. The foundation is fully engaged, and the transfer points are aligned right now, my beloved child. And the specific, every support point active, distribution system ready. The foundation is waiting for the wall to release. What the foundation was built to hold readiness, that the activated structure is producing beneath the wall, is the final stage before the weight transfers from isolated carrying to distributed holding. I need you to feel the proximity of the releasing, not the distant. Maybe someday I will find relief, when the weight reduces on its own proximity that the solo carrying framework was producing as the default relationship between you and the exhaustion the solo carrying was generating. The present tense. Foundation is active. Transfer points are aligned. The designer is reaching toward the weight. The releasing is available right now, proximity of a structural correction whose every component is in position and whose only remaining variable is the wall's willingness to let the weight move from a single point to the multiple points foundation provides. The foundation is ready. The wall must release. And releasing is the only remaining variable. My dear one, everything has been building toward this release. The first layer that was within specifications, the accumulation that crossed the threshold without warning, the support points that thinned while the weight increased, the adaptation that converted structural isolation into spiritualized endurance, the definition that equated partnership with weakness, the fractures forming in the quiet places, the framework that called the bending faithfulness, the foundation being built beneath the solo carrying, during the solo carrying, the activation of the support system. And now, the release, the specific, wall to foundation, isolated to distributed, solo to partnered transfer, that the designer has been preparing for the entire duration the wall was holding, what only the foundation was specified to carry. My child, the transfer does not require the wall to become weaker. The transfer requires the wall to become willing. And willing is the structural posture that allows a strong wall to release a foundation category load onto the foundation that was built to receive it. Strong and willing, not strong and solo. That is the specification the designer drew. Type strong and willing if the foundation is fully engaged and the transfer points are aligned. The only remaining variable being the wall's willingness to release the weight onto the structure that was built to hold it. And the designer is not asking the wall to become weaker, but to become willing, because the original specification was never strong and solo, but was always strong and willing. And willing is the structural posture that allows a strong wall to release what only a foundation was designed to carry. The wall just released, the weight just transferred, and the foundation category load that has been bending a single wall for the duration of the solo carrying season is now being distributed across multiple support points by a foundation whose specifications were drawn for exactly this weight, at exactly this volume, by the same designer who built the wall, and who always knew the wall was never meant to hold what the foundation was built to carry. My beloved child, this is the moment. The moment the weight moves from the wall to the foundation, and the wall stands upright for the first time, since the accumulation crossed the threshold the specifications could not sustain. The moment the bending stops, not because the weight disappeared, but because the weight is now being held by the structure that was designed for its category. The moment the stress fractures in the quiet places stop receiving new pressure, because the pressure has been redistributed from the single point that was absorbing all of it to the multiple points that were always built to share it. The wall is upright, for the first time in a long time. What you are carrying right now is too heavy, because it was never meant for you to carry alone. The title said too heavy. The fractures confirm it. The title said never meant for you to carry alone. The foundation confirms it, and the wall that has been bending under a foundation category load since the support points thinned and the solo carrying was spiritualized. As endurance is now standing upright inside a structure whose foundation is holding what the wall was never specified to hold without it. My child, the upright does not feel like strength. The upright feels like relief. And relief is the structural sensation a wall produces when a load that exceeded its specifications is transferred to the foundation that was engineered for the load's exact category, and the wall's internal structure is no longer absorbing what only distributed support was ever designed to sustain. The relief is the correction, and the correction just happened. Now that the weight has transferred, and the foundation is holding, and the wall is upright for the first time. Everything about the solo carrying identity that governed your relationship with the weight is being permanently dismantled by the structural evidence that the foundation is holding what the wall was never specified to carry alone. And the holding is stable, and the distribution is working, and the fractures are no longer receiving new pressure. My dear child, this is what happens when a wall that has been spiritualizing the solo carrying as faithfulness encounters the foundation, doing what the solo carrying could not, holding the same weight without fractures. The spiritualized identity does not merely adjust, it is structurally disproved. Because the spiritualized identity said the solo carrying was the holy response, and the foundation holding the same weight without stress is the structural demonstration that the holy response was always the partnership the spiritualized identity was rejecting. Solo fractures, partnership holds. The structure just proved which one the designer specified. My beloved child, the disproving is producing cascading effects across every area of your identity where the solo-carrying framework was governing your behavior. The definition that equated partnership with weakness is being overturned because the foundation's stable holding of what the wall was fracturing under is the structural evidence that partnership is not weakness, but is the correct engineering for the load category. The receiving system that was closed by the adaptation is being reopened because the wall just experienced the transfer and the experience of weight, leaving the wall's structure and landing on the foundation without collapse is the most powerful reopening signal the closed system can receive. The system is reopening by the experience of the transfer working, and the exhaustion that was deeper than tiredness is being addressed at the structural level the exhaustion was operating at. Because the exhaustion was not produced by the weight itself, but by the wall carrying the weight at a load category above its specifications, and the structural correction that transferred the weight to the foundation is the structural relief, the bone-level exhaustion required. Tight partnership holds if the solo-carrying identity just encountered its structural disproof. The foundation holding the same weight without fractures, while the wall was fracturing under it, and the definition equating partnership with weakness is being overturned, because the stable holding proves partnership is correct engineering for the load category, and the receiving system that was closed is reopening by the experience of the transfer working, and the bone-level exhaustion is being addressed at the structural level the exhaustion was operating at. Let me show you what your life looks like. Now that the weight has been transferred and the foundation is holding and the wall is upright and the fractures are no longer receiving new pressure because a wall standing upright inside a properly loaded foundation operates at a capacity the bending version could never access. My dear one, the first thing that changes is the energy. You have been operating on structural excess energy. The specific, everything I produce is being consumed by the holding. There is nothing left for anything else. The weight takes first, and I get what remains, depletion, that a wall produces when the load absorbs the capacity. Before the capacity can be directed toward anything the wall was also designed to do. The weight is on the foundation now, and the energy the weight was consuming is returning to the wall. My beloved child, the mornings change permanently. You have been waking into the weight. The first conscious awareness of each day registering the familiar. The load is still here. The bending begins again. The carrying resumes heaviness that the solo carrying season was producing as the default morning condition. Tomorrow you wake upright. The morning processes without the weight's first claim on the day's energy, because the foundation is holding the weight through the night, and the night-held weight does not transfer back to the wall when the morning arrives. Upright mornings carry available energy. Bending mornings carried consumed energy. The capacity you thought was exhausted was never exhausted. It was being consumed by the holding, and consumed capacity that is released by the transfer of the weight returns to the wall at a volume the wall has not experienced since before the accumulation crossed the threshold, meaning the capacity that is about to become available exceeds what the wall remembers having, because the wall has been carrying the load so long. The wall forgot what full capacity felt like. Full capacity is returning, and returning capacity opens what consumed capacity was closing. People around you are going to notice the uprightness before you describe the transfer, because a wall standing at full height inside a properly loaded foundation produces an atmospheric presence that the bending version could never generate, regardless of how faithfully the bending version was holding the weight the bending was produced by. My beloved child, the ones who knew you during the bending season, who interacted with the consumed energy version, who sensed the specific quality of a person whose every available resource was being absorbed by a weight the person was carrying before the person could direct anything toward the interaction being offered, who perhaps attributed the depletion to poor self-care when the depletion was always the structural consequence of a wall absorbing a foundation category load on a single point of support. Those people are about to encounter the upright version. They will say something lifted off of you. They will be describing the transfer. My child, there is a specific quality a person carries when the weight they were bending under has been placed onto the foundation the designer built to hold it. The quality is not the absence of responsibility. It is the specific. The weight is still real, but the carrying is distributed. I am standing upright inside a structure that is holding what I was holding alone quality of a wall operating within its specifications. For the first time since the accumulation crossed the threshold, the specifications could not sustain. The quality is structural relief, and structural relief produces an atmosphere consumed capacity could not. Connections that require the specific atmospheric quality of a person operating at returned capacity within a properly loaded foundation are approaching the upright wall right now. There are relationships and opportunities whose formation demands the available energy that only a wall whose weight has been transferred to the foundation can produce. Because the formation requires capacity, the consumed version was directing entirely toward the holding. My dear one, what approaches an upright wall is calibrated to the returned capacity the transfer produced. and returned capacity connections exceed anything the bending version was attracting. Type structural relief. If the transfer is producing an atmospheric quality, the bending version could never carry the specific. Weight is real but distributed, standing upright inside the structure quality of structural relief. And connections requiring the available energy of a person operating at returned capacity within a properly loaded foundation are approaching, because their formation demands the capacity the consumed version was directing entirely toward the holding. And the returned capacity is now available for everything the solo carrying was preventing. I need you to understand why I built you as a load-bearing wall rather than as the full foundation, because the building choice reveals something about the role I always intended you to play within the structure that the solo carrying was preventing you from occupying. My beloved child, I could have built you as the full foundation. The foundation would have carried the weight without fractures. The foundation would have distributed the load across its own multiple points, without requiring partnership from any external support system. And the foundation would have operated in isolation exactly the way the wall was attempting to operate, self-sufficiently, without the need for the structural partnership the designer's specifications include. I built you as a wall, not as a foundation. And the distinction is the design. My child, a wall within a foundation serves a specific function the foundation alone cannot. The foundation holds the weight. The wall directs the structure. The foundation provides the carrying. The wall provides the purpose the carrying supports. A wall trying to be the foundation loses the capacity to perform the wall's unique function, because the energy the wall was designed to direct toward its purpose is being consumed by the carrying the foundation was designed to perform. The wall has a purpose the foundation cannot replace, and the purpose requires the wall's energy. My dear one, I chose you for the wall role because the purpose embedded in your design requires the specific, directed, this is what the wall was built to do function that only a wall standing upright inside a properly loaded foundation can perform. The solo carrying was not fulfilling the wall's purpose. The solo carrying was consuming the energy the purpose requires, and a wall whose energy is consumed by the foundation's job cannot perform the wall's job. You were not built to be the foundation. You were built to stand inside one, and standing inside a foundation while the foundation carries the weight is the position the designer always drew for the wall, whose purpose requires its full energy. The doubt surfacing right now is using the most endurance-hardened objection in its inventory. The voice that says releasing the weight onto the foundation is abandonment of the people and responsibilities the weight represents, because the wall has been carrying them, and the carrying has become the relationship. And releasing the carrying feels like releasing the relationship, my child. It sounds like this. The weight is not abstract. The weight is specific people, specific responsibilities, specific obligations that were placed on this wall, because this wall was the one who showed up when the weight needed carrying. Releasing the weight onto the foundation feels like telling the people the weight represents that the wall is no longer willing to hold what the people needed held. The transfer feels like abandonment. And abandonment of the people the weight represents is not something the wall can spiritualize as structural correction, because the people are real, and the carrying is how the wall has been expressing love for them. That doubt just equated the transfer with the abandonment, and the equation fails against one structural fact. My beloved child, transferring the weight to the foundation does not abandon the weight. It stabilizes the weight. A wall holding a foundation category load is an unstable holding, a single point absorbing what multiple points were designed to distribute. And unstable holding means that people and responsibilities the weight represents are being held on a structure that is fracturing in the quiet places. The transfer does not remove the holding. The transfer stabilizes the holding by moving the weight from an unstable single point to a stable distributed system. The people the weight represents deserve stable holding, not fracturing holding. A wall that transfers the weight to the foundation is not abandoning the people the weight represents. A wall that transfers the weight is protecting the people the weight represents from the collapse the fractures were approaching. Because a wall that collapses under the weight it refused to release does not produce faithfulness. It produces catastrophe. Type stable, not abandoned, if the doubt equated releasing the weight with abandoning the people the weight represents. And the structural fact the doubt cannot account for is that transferring the weight from a fracturing wall to a stable foundation does not abandon the holding but stabilizes it, meaning the people and responsibilities the weight represents deserve stable distributed holding rather than fracturing isolated holding, and a wall that collapses under the weight it refused to release produces catastrophe, not faithfulness. During every season the wall was carrying the foundation category load alone. I was not at the foundation waiting for the wall to eventually release what the wall was absorbing without the designer's presence beside the absorbing. I was at the wall, my beloved child, at the fracture points, feeling the stress the excess was producing from the position of a designer whose hands built the wall and whose hands know where the fractures form before the fractures become visible to anyone reading the structure from the outside. You imagined a God who designed the wall's specifications and then observed from the structural engineering level whether the wall would eventually reach the willingness to release the weight onto the foundation the designer built. A God whose involvement during the solo carrying season was limited to the sovereign knowledge that the wall was exceeding its specifications without the personal presence beside the wall during the exceeding. I was never at the engineering level during the solo season. I was at the wall, at the fractures, with you, my child, being at the fracture points of a wall that is exceeding its specifications. While the wall believes the exceeding is faithfulness is the most tender form of presence the designer produces. The designer knows the fractures are forming. The designer knows the margin is thinning. The designer knows the load category exceeds the wall's specifications. And the designer is beside the wall through every layer of excess. Not because the designer approves of the solo carrying, but because the designer does not leave the wall during the solo carrying. Designer is waiting for the wall to release. There were nights during the solo season when the bone-level exhaustion was at its deepest, when the carrying had consumed the last reserve, and the wall was operating on structural excess that the reserve could no longer supplement. On those nights, the designer was at the fracture points, applying the specific, temporary, I am holding the margin open while the wall is holding the weight reinforcement that prevented the fractures from reaching the failure threshold before the wall reached the willingness to transfer. My dear one, the margin held because the designer was reinforcing it, not because the wall was strong enough to sustain the excess indefinitely. I know the exact night the fractures reached the count where the margin the designer was reinforcing was reduced to its thinnest remaining thread. The specific evening where the bone-level exhaustion and the accumulated weight and the closed receiving system and the spiritualized solo carrying converged at a structural point, whose total stress exceeded every previous night's load by a margin. The wall registered as the closest it has ever been to the threshold between holding and failing, my dear one. Not the first hard night, not the heaviest single layer, the night the total converged, the specific evening where every layer that had been added since the first specification crossing weight arrived pressed simultaneously against the fracture points. The quiet places were carrying, producing the specific. Every fracture active at once. The wall is at its structural minimum. One more degree of pressure and the holding becomes failing experience that a wall produces when the total accumulated stress reaches the margin's final thread. My beloved child, I know that night because the designer's reinforcement was at maximum intensity during the exact hours the total converged. Maximum reinforcement means the designer's hands were at every fracture point simultaneously, holding the margin open at its thinnest thread, while the total stress was pressing from the weight side and the reinforcement was pressing from the designer side, and the wall existed between the two pressures on a thread that was sustained by the designer's hands, rather than by the wall's remaining structural capacity. The thread held because the hands held the thread, not because the wall held the thread. My child, the God whose hands were at maximum reinforcement on the night the margin was at its thinnest is the God confirming tonight that the wall was never sustaining itself during the final thread. The wall was being sustained by hands. The wall could not feel because the hands were operating at the fracture level the wall's awareness does not reach. The hands were always there, at the fractures, holding what the wall thought it was holding alone. Type hands at the fractures. If God just identified the specific night, the total stress converged at the margin's thinnest thread, and the designer's reinforcement was at maximum intensity at every fracture point simultaneously, because the thread between holding and failing was being sustained by the designer's hands rather than by the wall's remaining structural capacity, meaning the wall was never actually holding alone during the final thread, and the hands thought the wall not feel were operating at the fracture level the wall's awareness does not reach. Now that the weight has been transferred, and the foundation is holding, and the wall is upright, and the fractures are no longer receiving new pressure, there is one thing I need you to do, my beloved child, and it is the instruction that determines whether the structural correction the designer just performed becomes the permanent operating arrangement, or whether the solo carrying identity reinstalls itself when the unfamiliar sensation of standing upright without the weight encounters the muscle memory of carrying. Stay upright. Not release the weight onto the foundation and then reach back for it when the upright feels unfamiliar. Not transfer the load to the distributed system and then pull portions of it back onto the wall because the wall does not know what to do with its energy. When the energy is not being consumed by the holding, stay upright in the position the transfer produced, without reaching back for what the foundation is now holding. My child, the reaching back is the solo carrying identity's reflex. The wall has been carrying for so long that the sensation of not carrying feels like the absence of purpose rather than the presence of correction. And a wall that interprets the absence of weight as the absence of purpose will reach back for the weight the foundation is holding, not because the wall needs the weight, but because the wall has forgotten what the wall's actual purpose feels like when the wall's energy is not being consumed by the carrying. The reaching back must be resisted, not with effort but with recognition. Recognition that the unfamiliar sensation of upright is not purposelessness, but is the return of the wall's capacity to the wall's actual function. The function the carrying was consuming. The function the designer drew the specifications for. The function that requires the wall's full energy. Energy that was being absorbed by the foundation's job. The wall was performing without the foundation structure. Stay upright. Let the foundation hold, and redirect the returned energy toward the purpose the carrying was consuming. The purpose has been waiting for the energy the solo carrying was absorbing, and the energy just returned. You made it to the upright, my beloved child, and I need you to stand in the released position long enough to feel what it means to be a wall whose weight has been transferred to the foundation the designer built, and whose fractures are no longer receiving new pressure, and whose energy is returning for the first time since the accumulation crossed the threshold the specifications could not sustain. Feel the upright, not the weight, not the bending that was produced by a load category the wall was never specified to carry alone, not the spiritualized solo carrying whose framework called the bending faithfulness while the fractures were forming in the quiet places, not the exhaustion that was deeper than tiredness, because the exhaustion was structural excess rather than insufficient rest. The upright, the specific weight is on the foundation, fractures are resting, energy is returning, the wall is standing at full height inside a properly loaded structure upright that the transfer just produced in a wall whose bending season lasted longer than any single wall should have been asked to bend. The upright feels like relief. And relief is what the designer was always reaching toward the weight to produce. I want to thank you for something the solo carrying made almost impossible to sustain. Thank you for holding. Thank you for a wall that exceeded its specifications for a duration the specifications were never drawn to sustain. Thank you for the fractures that formed in the quiet places while the outside maintained its form. Because the maintaining meant the wall did not collapse during the solo season, and the not collapsing is the reason the wall is still standing to receive the transfer the foundation just completed. My dear child, thank you for not collapsing, because a wall that collapses under the weight before the foundation activates is a wall whose structure requires rebuilding before the transfer can occur. You bent. You fractured quietly, but you did not collapse. And the not collapsing preserved the wall for the correction the designer was always preparing to make. Let the tears come. Not exhaustion tears, not bending tears, upright tears. The tears of a wall standing at full height for the first time since the weight crossed the threshold. Undone by the quiet, structural, the designer reached toward the weight before the margin was gone relief of a person whose solo carrying just ended, not because the person stopped being strong, but because the foundation took what the strength was never specified to hold alone. Type upright tears if tears are forming right now, because the wall is standing at full height for the first time. And the tears are not exhaustion, but the relief of a structure whose weight was just transferred to the foundation the designer built, meaning the bending is over, and the fractures are resting, and the energy is returning, and the solo carrying ended, not because the wall failed, but because the designer reached toward the weight before the margin was gone, and placed it onto the foundation that was always specified to hold what no single wall was ever designed to sustain alone. You are not the wall bending under the weight alone anymore, my beloved child. That identity, the one whose support points thinned while the weight increased, and whose adaptation converted the structural isolation into spiritualized endurance, the one whose definition of faithfulness equated solo carrying with spiritual strength and partnership with spiritual weakness, the one whose fractures were forming in the quiet places while the outside maintained its form, the one whose receiving system was closed by the adaptation that classified the abandoned support. As evidence, the wall did not need support. The one whose bone-level exhaustion was produced not by insufficient rest, but by a load category above the wall's specifications being sustained on a single point of support for a duration. Specifications were never drawn to sustain. That identity was permanently retired the moment the designer activated the foundation and the weight transferred from the wall to the distributed system, and the wall stood upright for the first time. And the fractures stopped receiving new pressure, and the energy the carrying was consuming began returning to a wall whose purpose was waiting for the energy the solo carrying was absorbing. You are the upright wall inside a properly loaded foundation now. And upright changes everything the bending was teaching. The solo carrying identity that governed your relationship with the weight, your definition of faithfulness, your closed receiving system, your spiritualized endurance, and the bone-level exhaustion that was produced by structural excess rather than insufficient rest, has been permanently disproved by the structural evidence of a foundation holding the same weight without fractures, demonstrating that the weight was always a foundation category load, and the solo carrying was always structural isolation. And the isolation was always the condition the fractures were produced by. My dear child, the wall was never weak, the load was never wall category, and the carrying was never the specification the designer drew. From this moment forward, you carry the identity of a wall whose God builds foundations, not a person who carries alone and calls the carrying faith, a person whose designer drew specifications that include partnership as a structural requirement rather than a spiritual weakness, specifications that place the wall inside a foundation whose multiple support points distribute the weight. The wall was never engineered to hold on a single point of support. Not a person whose strength is measured by how much they carry alone. A person whose strength is measured by the purpose they fulfill when the carrying is placed on the structure the designer built to carry it. The weight is on the foundation. The foundation is holding. The wall is upright. And the person whose bending season lasted longer than any single wall should have been asked to bend is now standing at full height inside a structure whose design always included the partnership the solo carrying was refusing, finally understanding that the designer who built the wall never drew solo carrying into the specifications, and the foundation that was built during the solo season was always waiting to be activated, and the activation just happened, and the upright that the transfer produced is the position the designer always intended for a wall, whose purpose requires its full energy. The weight stays, the foundation holds it, the wall stands upright, and the God who designed the load-bearing specifications, and who was at the fracture points during every night of the solo carrying, and who reinforced the margin at its thinnest thread with hands the wall could not feel, is the same God standing beside the upright wall tonight, confirming that putting it down was never failure, but was always the correct structural decision. Because a wall that releases a foundation category load onto the foundation the designer built to hold it is not a wall abandoning the weight, but a wall trusting the designer, whose specification always said, "This weight was never meant for one wall to carry alone." Strong and willing, inside the foundation, upright at full energy, that is the specification. And the specification just became the reality. Subscribe to this channel so that every time the designer reaches toward the weight, the structural correction reaches you before the solo carrying identity convinces you the bending is faithfulness. You are not a wall carrying alone anymore. You are a wall standing upright inside a properly loaded foundation, whose designer built the distributed support system during the solo season and activated it before the margin was gone. The next message carries the first upright report from a wall whose weight was transferred to the foundation, and what the returned energy produces when the wall's purpose receives capacity the solo carrying was consuming will prove that the specification was always partnership, and the partnership was always available, and the designer was always at the fracture points, waiting for the wall to let the foundation hold what the wall was never built to sustain alone. Type upright in the foundation if you are leaving this message permanently changed, knowing the solo carrying was structural isolation, not spiritual endurance. The definition equating partnership with weakness was written by the thinning, not by the designer. The fractures were stress from excess, not evidence of weakness. The exhaustion was structural, not physical. The foundation was being built during the solo season. The designer's hands were at the fracture points, reinforcing the margin. The wall thought it was holding on its own. And the God who built the wall and drew the specifications and activated the foundation and reached toward the weight before the margin was gone is confirming tonight that what you are carrying was never meant for you to carry alone, and the foundation is holding, and the wall is upright, and the purpose the solo carrying was consuming is now receiving the energy it was always waiting for.